Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing Bigfoot stories. Let's get into it. Story 1. Noted author on bear behavior, Alaskan Larry Knit, writes that he heard an interesting story. It's unconfirmed at this time, but allegedly was written up in Alaska magazine at some point. The story goes like this. Supposedly, a Nome, Alaska pilot and his newlywed wife were en route to Anchorage, where they would make connections for their honeymoon. The weather turned sour, so he touched down in a Cessna 180 or 185 on floats. He taxied to shore, where he and his wife looked for a spot to pitch their tent for the night. Having found one, he turned toward the plane to fetch the tent with his wife following him. He heard his wife scream and turned to see a hairy biped running from the location toward the woods with his wife under one arm. The pilot chased after the critter before realizing that he could best stop it with his firearm and returned to the plane to fetch his rifle. He followed, seeing them 3 times before he lost sight of them. He found a particle of cloth from his wife's garment. He either spent the night in his tent and looked the next day, or flew on to Anchorage and reported the event to the Alaskan state troopers, who began a search but were unable to come up with any positive results. The wife was never found, and I was told that the pilot was distraught in a basket case for years. Story 2. I have read with great interest all of the encounters located at the website, and I would like to add my own experience. It was July of 1967, and myself and 2 very good friends were on an all-night bass fishing excursion on a strip mine pit just west of Farmington, Illinois. The fishing was bad because of intense rain that came and went as the evening wore on. Around 11 p.m., I was standing next to one of the 2 friends when I heard a sound coming from down the gravel road that went by the lake. The sound was coming from quite a distance, and at first I thought it was a katydid, but I was surprised at the volume and realized it was not an insect sound, but something much larger. As the sound drew closer, the volume increased to the point where my friend, who was fishing in the same location as me, stopped reeling his line in and asked, "What is that?" I told him I didn't know, but I noticed that it was getting louder and sounded like it was coming towards us. The sound got louder and louder. It was actually very irritating to the ears. Our other friend finally hollered at us and told us to knock it off. We told him it wasn't us making the noise. We stopped fishing and walked over to where he was standing. By this time the noise was excruciatingly loud, and the frogs and insects had stopped croaking and singing. Suddenly there was the sound of a very large body jumping into the shallow water slough next to the lake where we were fishing in. Whatever it was that jumped in the water began making deep, booming sounds in the water by lifting its feet clear of the water and then crashing them back in flat-footed. We just stood there in the pitch blackness and listened until the creature came out of the water on our side of the bank and started making its way through the 8-foot tall reeds between us and him. I walked a few feet away from my friends towards the sound it was making walking through the reeds, and stopped on a footpath that went around that end of the lake, and stood there as the creature stepped almost all the way through the reeds. I remember looking up at something that towered over me, but was just a black mass in a mass of tan-colored reeds. I didn't smell anything or see anything clearly, but whatever it was stopped and stood there as though it was looking at me. Instantly, I took off on a dead run around the lake toward a house on the other side of the lake to see if I could get some help for us. When I got to the back porch of the house, I heard a couple more splashes and saw by the dim porch light that my 2 friends had jumped in the water, and one of them had drawn his knife and was hollering for me to get back over there as the thing was standing just a few feet away. I took off running, and when I got to the other side in 20 seconds or so, the creature had backed off and was now in the reeds again. It jumped back in the water and got back out and approached us again, and this time the 3 of us hid underneath an overturned John boat that was lying on the bank. The creature stomped around the boat and I got the knife from my friend and prepared to stab at any fingers that attempted to lift the boat off of us, but the creature just went back to the slough and jumped back in. He walked up and down the slough for the rest of the night screaming that sound until the sun was about ready to come up, at which time it went back down the gravel road in the direction it had come from and gradually out of hearing. I have heard recorded sounds allegedly made by Sasquatch or Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest on other internet sites, and sound this creature made was very similar, especially considering the intense volume. Our encounter with this creature lasted at least 5 hours, and I will never forget it and the terrorizing effect it had on myself and my friends. This account is true to my best recollection of an event that occurred over 43 years ago, but seems like it was just last week. Story 3. Back in the early 70s, I believe between 1970 and 72, I had an experience that I believe could have been Bigfoot. I lived in the country at the time about 2 miles from the Mackinac River, which is a pretty heavily wooded area. I was sitting on the ground shooting at birds and it was getting dark out. I was about 150 to 200 feet from the barn when all of a sudden the barn door opened and something started coming out. I do not recall any details about what I saw because I was so scared. I do know that whatever it was, it took up the whole space of the barn door. It was dark, so if it was a man, he would have had to have been a large man, and I'm not convinced that is what I saw. I ran into the house right away. I was around 10 or 12 at the time, and we locked the doors. The dogs started barking real soon after I saw whatever it was, and barked for about 3 solid hours, more than I had ever heard them bark before, or have ever heard dogs bark. Nobody else saw it, but a friend saw a shadow go across the barn when he looked out the window. We called the sheriff's office, and a couple of officers went out and looked around, but did not find anything. I wish I had just stayed there and got a better look, but I didn't. I cannot recall how much time later, but within a couple months or so, that me and my brother and my cousin found the front half of a pig down about 100 feet from the barn. There were no bones of the missing part of the pig, just a half of a young pig, probably about 6 months old. Something unusual about this is that there were no animals around that could have done this, and if a human was going to do this, I'm sure he would have stolen the whole pig, not just half of it. I have thought about this. It happened around the time Bigfoot was a subject of a lot of sightings in Illinois. In the early 1970s, there were a few sightings reported around this area. I know that this is not a very good report, being that it could have been something else other than Bigfoot. I am not without doubt, but I believe that it may have been Bigfoot more than a human being, and being Bigfoot enthusiast, I would like to think that it might have been him. Story 4. My name is Anonymous. I've been keeping this secret since around 1986 and didn't know who I could tell without sounding like a nut, but it's been bothering me, and I hope you're the appropriate person to contact regarding this matter. Here's what my wife and I saw. During the late summer of 1986, my wife Mary and I were driving east on Highway 50 heading toward Lake Tahoe at about 11:30 p.m. We were about 25-30 miles west of Lake Tahoe when we approached an S-curve. As we made a right turn, the road curved toward a mountainside and then turned away to the left. While making the right turn, however, our headlights were facing the side of a hill and something else we were not prepared for. About 40 yards directly in front of us, we saw a huge, hairy, man-like creature walking along the side of this hill at the roadside of our headlights were directly on it, and there was no mistaking what we saw at that distance. As we made the left turn away from the hill, the thing disappeared into the darkness. My wife and I stared off ahead, and as we drove a short distance, both turned to look at each other, and we said, "Did you see that?" I knew I hadn't imagined it because she saw it too. Now the problem was who we could tell without sounding crazy, so we never told a soul, but I've been searching for the right person to tell because it's been eating at me for all these years. I hope you were the right person. Thank you. Story 5. It happened on October 23rd, 1987. While hunting in Azusa Canyon by the experimental forest, I found a game trail with very fresh tracks and followed them to a small stream rain runoff. I started digging up some scorpions to pay for the trip and to take to a pet store to sell when the ground started shaking. I heard a thumping noise that sounded like something very heavy and extremely big was coming my way at a high rate of speed. It was heading downhill in my direction. I moved behind a large boulder for protection and chambered a bullet in my rifle. Shouldering the rifle, I looked through my scope, and that is when I saw it, about 45 yards distance. It was about 8 to 10 feet tall and extremely muscular. I estimated it weighed between 1,300 and 1,700 pounds. It was black. It was not threatening, just staring and wanting to pass. We stood and sized each other up until I backed off. I didn't fire. I am sure my rifle wouldn't drop the thing. It was that large. I continued to back up and then ran toward my truck, having to circle to get back to my truck. There was only 45 yards between us. I was a very young man, ex-bodyguard who could bench 550 pounds. This has forever changed my life. I have run into other people who have seen it. I was sober and I did not do drugs. I have never hunted again. I saw it in the sunlight around noon. Story 6. My girlfriend and I were camping along Highway 128 in Mendocino County, California. We stayed in an area called Hendy Woods. Highway 128 goes north-northwest from Cloverdale on US 101 to the coast near the Albion Fort Bragg area, and Hendy Woods is in the redwood belt between Boonville and the coast. We decided to go to Montgomery Woods one morning, being told it was not a camping area and wouldn't have the motorhomes and kid-filled campsites, and the trees preserved there were spectacular. We arrived at Montgomery Woods about 8 a.m. and were going to hike the self-guided trail. The parking area is small, and it looked like we were the first, if not the only ones there. It was a cool, foggy September day. About a half hour into the hike, my girlfriend thought she heard someone on the trail behind us. We stopped and waited, but there was no noise. We continued to the base of a huge redwood and sat to rest. The redwoods are an eerily quiet place, with the thick, soft redwood bark and ankle-deep tree leaves and needles absorbing lots of ambient sound. Suddenly we heard something moving through the undergrowth 20 or 30 yards away from the canopy of trees. It was big, heavy, and moving at a good pace. I whistled, and the movement stopped. This was as scared as I've ever been. It was silent for a minute or so, then the movement continued. Whatever it was so close, and I was frustrated that I could only see brush moving, but not the creature. It stopped moving about 100 feet or so away, then let out a scream that would scare the dead. We froze, thinking this was it. From behind us, several hundred yards to the west, came a similar scream, as if responding to the first. We looked back, but couldn't tell where exactly it came from. Then the first creature screamed again, louder and longer than the first time. I can't tell you how loud it was. The lung capacity was enormous. I can remember thinking that we might be surrounded, and that we might die here. Suddenly the first creature started to move, not away, but parallel to the trail. There was a bit of a clearing, and we saw the left side of a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered biped. I've met Shaquille O'Neal at the LA airport, and this thing was so much bulkier, huge through the chest and shoulders. I only saw the left arm, and the wrist was the diameter of my biceps. It looked at us for 2 or 3 seconds, then returned to its right and hustled down the ravine. We looked through the trees to follow its progress, but we had waited a minute or two, and it was gone. Story 7. In 1959, age 22, I was hitchhiking from Biggs, Oregon, down US Highway 97 to Klamath Falls. About halfway through the trip, I was picked up by a man who asked if I planned to do any camping in the Cascades. I said no. He said good, because there are things up there that will kill you quick. I said, you mean grizzlies? Which I had seen in Yellowstone. No, he replied, not grizzlies. And he told me this story, which I am paraphrasing. I used to work for a company that builds logging roads. One day we got a report that one of our roads, he didn't say where, had washed out. I went out in my truck to find out what would be needed to fix it. About 3 or 4 miles from the highway, I noticed a rocky outcropping and something glinting in the sun. I was an amateur prospector, always looking for signs of a strike. I stopped my truck, took out my rock hammer, and walked up to the outcropping, which was about 10 feet high. I started chipping away at the rock, trying to get a sample. When I stopped hammering, I heard a clicking sound from the bushes across the road, about 60 feet away. It sounded like someone knocking 2 stones together. I wasn't afraid because I had a .45 on my hip, so I resumed chipping. When I stopped, again I heard the clicking sound, which was louder. I yelled toward the bushes, saying, "Come out and show yourself." I started chipping again, and suddenly a stone the size of a grapefruit smashed into the rock face about 3 feet from my head. If it had hit me, it would have killed me. I dropped my hammer, pulled my .45, and picked up the stone, which was rolling across the road. I tried to throw it back into the bushes, but it was so heavy I could only toss it 7 feet. Scared and angry, I crossed the road, shouting curse words, and fired a shot in the air. At that point, I heard something moving rapidly through the bushes and fading away alongside the road. I continued watching in that direction, and suddenly there it was, a black, hairy, 2-legged being, sort of bent over but moving fast. Then it was gone, just like that. I looked around in the bushes and saw a few broken branches, but nothing else. But there was a terrible stink in the air. I got into my truck and drove back to the highway in a hurry. A couple of years later, I told a friend what happened, and he knew all about these creatures. He said they don't hurt people, which I didn't believe for a second, and the stone was thrown in my direction was probably just a warning. He also said the creatures don't usually smell bad, but when they are mad or frightened, they spray some kind of stinky liquid, like a skunk does. That was it. I had never heard of Bigfoot before that, and did not believe the story, thinking he was pulling the leg of a dude from the east, but I pretended to believe him because he was giving me a free ride in his truck. It wasn't until many years later I began hearing reports about Bigfoot and remembered the story I heard in Oregon. I still wonder if it might be a hoax of some kind.